we talked about fractions and we also talked about decimals, and at the end of the decimals unit we converted between decimals and fractions. Today we're going to review a little bit about that, but we're going to take it one step further. We're going to change decimals, fractions into percents, and we're going to go the other way as well. So today you're going to learn to convert, which means to change, between fractions, decimals, and percents, which means I should be able to give you a percent and you could change it to a fraction or a decimal, and I should be able to give you a decimal, you can change it to a percent or a fraction, and I should be able to give you a fraction and you can make it a decimal or a percent. Alright, so let's get started with a little bit of a visual. The word percent means a number out of 100. You may be familiar with this. This is called a base 10 block, and you might have used them in elementary school a good bit, but they're a good way to introduce percents. So in this example, I want you to shade 20% of this grid. Now I'm going to go ahead and tell you that this is a hundreds grid, so there are 100 squares on this grid. So I want you to shade 20%. Now, because percent means a number out of 100, that means I'm asking you to shade 20 out of 100. So you go ahead and do that now. Okay. I did my best coloring job possible. Now, yours may not look exactly like mine. You could have used 2 rows up and down. You could have used 2 rows side to side at the top. You could have gone diagonally, or you could have picked 20 random squares in this 100 block. But the point is, did you color in 20 squares? As long as the answer is yes, you're good to move on. Now, let's try 2 more examples. Please do both of these. Shade 64% of this grid and 18% of this grid. Remember that 64% means 64 out of 100. 18% means 18 out of 100. Go ahead and shade now. Okay, again, my artistic abilities are probably not as good as yours, but did you shade 64 blocks on this grid? If the answer is yes, you're good to go. Did you shade 18 blocks on this grid? If the answer is yes, we are ready to move on. Now, we're going to do one more example, except you'll see that I have added in a decimal here. You know how to shade 82 blocks, but do you know how to shade 0.5 of a block? Well, if this is 1 block, you simply cut it in half and only shade half of it. Now, because of the tool that I'm using to write, mine are not going to look as good as yours, but I'm going to certainly try my best. Please only do this block here. Okay, so I tried the best that I could. Here is my 0.5 shaded black, here is my 80, and here is my 2. Now, let's reverse it. What percent of this grid is shaded in? You're going to notice that I have several blocks that are only shaded with 0.5. You go ahead and count, and I will count at the same time. If you want a hint, I would recommend counting the entire whole blocks first and the half blocks last. Okay, what did you get as your answer? You should have gotten 47.5%. All right, let's go ahead and move on. Now, you're going to probably recognize this slide from when we changed fractions into decimals, but I've added a percent part too, so go ahead and bear with me. What percent of these triangles are colored in? Well, if you answered 7 out of 10, you're correct. In this box, I need you to write 7 over 10. Now, let's take this fraction, translate it to a decimal. How do you say this? Most of you would say 7/10. That would be correct. Now, how do you write that as a decimal? Well, 7/10. Okay, we should be good to go. That's all review up to this point. Now, we need to take this decimal and make it a percent. There are two ways that we can do this. You can do it either way, and you should do it the way that is easier for you. You could either take this number and multiply it times 100, or to make it easier, take that number and move the decimal point to the right 2 spaces. And you would put a 0 there. That would give you 70%. Let's try another one. So, what fraction of the triangles are colored in? Well, if you said 4 out of 10, you're correct. How do you say this fraction in words? 4/10. Now, how do you write 4/10 as a decimal? 0.4. Now, how do we change this to a percent? Again, you have two choices. Choice number 1, you can multiply times 100. Choice number 2, which I think is the easier way, is to move the decimal point 2 places. So you're going to end up with 40%. Okay, let's try this one, and then you're going to try one on your own. So here we have a 100 block. We need to first figure out our fraction. So how many blocks are colored in? I'll give you just a second to look or pause the video. Okay, you should have gotten 37 out of 100. Now, how do you make this a decimal? Well, how do you say this in word form? You should say 37 hundredths, which would give you 0.37. Then, let's make it a percent. You would take it and you would move the decimal 2 spots, which would give you 37%. All right, you try these two. Look up when you're ready for your answer. Okay, your answers are up. Remember, you can't always say the fraction in word form and get a perfect decimal. That usually works if you could put it over 100, over 10, or over 1,000. So remember how to divide as well. If you have a fraction, 1 over 4, remember that you can divide just like this and get your answer. So you should have gotten 1/4, 0.25, and 25%. And then for the bottom one, 3 over 10, 0.3, and 30%. Okay, go ahead and try these two. Remember, you can also use your calculator in order to divide the fractions to get your decimal. All right, here are your answers. 2 over 5, 0.4, and 40% for the first illustration. 17 over 20, 0.85, and 85% for the second illustration. All right, look at this picture very carefully. There are red apples and green apples, but there are also apples with a bite taken out of them and apples that are whole. Look at this question very carefully. How many apples are red out of the total apples? Write your fraction, write your decimal, write your percent. Okay, you should have gotten 6 out of 20 apples are red. That would translate into 0.3%, and you could have gotten there by using your calculator, or you might have seen that you could have reduced this to 3 over 10, which would give you 3/10, and that changes into 30%. Now with the same picture, different question. How many apples have been bitten? Write your fraction, write your decimal, write your percent. Okay, so for your fraction, you should have gotten 8 out of 20. That would give you a decimal of 0.4 and a percent of 40%. All right, so we have a little matching game here. We need to match these items on the side to the chart where they belong. So let's go ahead and get started. What I'll do is I will grab them from the sides and we will find their place on here. So I have the fraction 1/4. Does it match 0.5, 1 over 10, 3 over 4, 0.2, or 1%, or none? It doesn't look like it matches any. So let's move on to the next one. Actually, you know what? I'm thinking it might actually be easier to look for them since there's so many. So let's start on the top row. If we have a decimal of 0.5 and we move that decimal point 2 spots, it's going to give us 50%. So where's our 50%? Here it is. Now, how do we write 50% as a fraction? Well, if we put if we say that is 5/10, that would be 1/2 when we simplified it, and the 1/2 is right over here. All right, let's move right along. How do you say this fraction? 1/10. So where is our 1/10? That should be 0.1. That's right over here. And if we have 0.1 and we move the decimal 2 spots, we're going to get 10%, which is right over here. Excellent. Now here we have 3/4, but we don't even have to really bother with dividing to find our decimal because it already gave us our percent. Now remember how when we moved from decimal to percent, we moved the decimal spot 2 places to the right. Well, we can also go backwards to go from percent to decimal. So we can move it 2 places to the left, and that will give us 0.75, which is right here. Next up, we have 0.2 as a decimal. How do you say that? 2/10. I don't see a 2 over 10, but I know that if I write 2 over 10, that can be simplified to 1 over 5. And I do see a 1 over 5 right here. Now, if I take this 0.2 and I make it a percent by moving the decimal 2 spots, I'm going to get 20%, which is right over here. All right, our last one, we're given a percent, 1%. Let's work backwards and find the decimal. So I need to move it 2 spots. So that's going to give me 0.01. which is going to be right over here. And how do I make this into a fraction? Well, how do you say that? 1/100th, which would be this guy right over here. And you have completed your chart. And there's your perfect solution. That's exactly what we just did. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of this lesson. Remember, you can always go back, fast forward, rewind, and pause as necessary. And as always, you can ask me questions in class.